Welcome to Stirling, the smallest city in Scotland, but also one of the country's most historically significant, as the nation's former capital. On this walk around this beautiful and historic city, we'll delve into the centuries of riveting heritage to be found on Stirling's streets. But we begin here, at the top of the town, outside the walls of Stirling Castle, first built all the way back in the 12th century. A vitally important fortress in Scottish history, Stirling's Castle is situated right in the heart of the country, between the Highlands and the densely populated central belt, which made it by many measures the most significant castle in the nation, and countless battles were fought to gain control of it. In fact, it's been said through time that he who holds Stirling holds Scotland, a truth exemplified by the key role that both Stirling Castle and the city as a whole have played in Scotland's centuries of military and political history. We'll talk more about that as we make our way through Stirling on this walk, but just outside the castle walls, there stands this iconic statue of a kilt-clad soldier bearing arms, Princess Louise's Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders Memorial, unveiled in 1907 in memory of those of the regiment who died fighting in the Second Boer War in South Africa. The reason that the statue is situated here is that the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders' historic headquarters were inside Stirling Castle, which existed primarily as a military fortress from around the 17th century onwards. Before then, Stirling Castle served as a major royal residence, and it was the site of numerous coronations, the most famous being that of Mary Queen of Scots in 1543, when she was just 1 year old. Beyond Mary, however, another Scottish royal closely associated with Stirling Castle would be King Robert the Bruce, depicted in this statue, and who ruled Scotland for 23 years in the early 14th century, most famously leading the nation's armies to victory over the English at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Fought just 3 miles south of Stirling here, Bannockburn is arguably the most celebrated triumph in Scottish history, but it wasn't the first significant clash with the English that took place near Stirling, coming just 17 years after the earlier Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, fought beside the River Forth, less than a mile from Stirling Castle here. But let's take a closer look at Stirling Castle in its modern shape, the intricate and heavily fortified castle protected by these mighty outer defences. Deeper inside the castle, you'll find an extensive complex of historic buildings of the 15th and 16th centuries, and royal residences, including the palace, originally built for King James V and his wife, as well as the King's Old Buildings, where King James IV lived. There's a wealth of riveting landmarks and stories to discover if you visit the interior of Stirling Castle. But why exactly was it this castle that became such an important centre for Scottish royals of the past? Well, as we mentioned, geography was a key player in the historic significance of Stirling, and as we can see from this map, the city is located right in the heart of the nation, between the wild Highlands and what we now know as the Central Belt, home to the major cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. As a result, Stirling Castle provided Scottish monarchs with a way to bind the northern and southern extremities of the kingdom closer together, while the presence of a strong fortification here also provided an important barrier to prevent England's armies advancing further north. In fact, after Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce actually ordered the destruction of Stirling Castle's defences, so that no enemy could use the castle in future. Although just over 20 years later in 1336, Stirling was eventually captured by the English, who rebuilt the castle to cement their position in Scotland. And as you can see as we look off the side of the castle, harsh terrain around Stirling made the castle here a valuable asset for the English, but their control of the fortress didn't last long, after a Scottish siege of Stirling Castle, led by the future King Robert II, forced the occupiers' surrender in 1342. Ever since, Stirling Castle has been in Scottish and/or British hands, but the siege of 1342 was by no means the last to take place here. Through its history, there have been at least 8 sieges on Stirling Castle, and the last of those took place in the mid-18th century. During the Jacobite Rising against the British government in 1746, the young Bonnie Prince Charlie, claiming to be the rightful king of Great Britain, led an assault on Stirling Castle, which was held by a garrison in the name of the British King George II. During the siege, Bonnie Prince Charlie directed his forces from a space just beside the castle, Stirling's Old Town Cemetery. In the middle distance between the trees, you might be able to see a large rock, known as Lady's Rock, on which Charlie stood as the castle siege raged for almost an entire month. But after all that fighting, the Jacobite siege ultimately proved a failure, and so they retreated north towards the city of Inverness, outside which their rebellion was brought to an end once and for all at the Battle of Culloden. Staying with Stirling's Old Town Cemetery here, meanwhile, just in front of us there stands a rather impressive pyramid, the Star Pyramid, otherwise known as Salem's Rock. Unveiled here in the cemetery in 1863, the Star Pyramid stands as a memorial to the martyrs of Scottish history, and it's thought to be the largest pyramid in the entire country, even ahead of the famous Balmoral Pyramid. But while it's certainly the largest monument in this graveyard, Stirling's Old Town Cemetery is filled with history in every corner, featuring graves as old as 700 years across its various grounds here at the top of the old town. And before it became the major burial ground it is today, the cemetery was actually used as a venue for jousting and witch executions in the medieval era. Nowadays, as well as offering some lovely views across the surrounding landscape from up on high, the Old Town Cemetery also stands just behind another of Stirling and Scotland's most important landmarks, the Church of the Holy Rood, which we can see just in the distance across the churchyard. So we'll now make our way away from the castle and towards the historic church, which will take us down the hill and closer to the heart of the modern city of Stirling, situated at the bottom of this hill, which is steeped in history. As we mentioned, Stirling today is the smallest of Scotland's 8 cities, having been awarded city status back in 2002 during the Golden Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II, but it's by no means a tiny place, home to as many as 40,000 people, and the city is often touted as one of the best places to live in Scotland in the modern day. Certainly, the combination of strong road and rail links to the likes of Edinburgh and Glasgow, with the beautiful, wide-open landscape of the Stirlingshire countryside, makes this a highly desirable part of Scotland, both for long-term residents and those visiting. But of course it's Stirling's enthralling history that we're most interested in on this walk, and just outside the castle walls, we see a hotel housed in the building that, between 1787 and 1856, was the home of Stirling Grammar School. And before that grammar school, another school existed on the same site, which was attended in the 16th century by none other than King James VI of Scotland, who had become king at the age of just 1. Much later on in life, James VI went on to also become James I of England, but it was just down from his school on this road, known as Castle Wynd, that one of the most important moments in James's life took place. We'll talk more about that in a few moments, but before us here is an impressively intact townhouse dating to the 17th century, regarded as the best preserved townhouse of its era in all of Scotland. Named Argyll's Lodging, this grand residence was historically used by the Earl of Stirling and later the Earls of Argyll, but the building is also notable for an event of 1625, when the Earl of Stirling signed documents giving him control over the entire province of Nova Scotia across the pond in Canada, which the Scots had gained after it had been originally colonised by the French. Nova Scotia, of course being Latin for New Scotland, still bears the Royal Arms of Scotland on its flag to this day, and you can learn more about it if you visit the inside of the beautiful Argyll's Lodgings, which later on in history were used as a headquarters for pro-British government officials before the Jacobite siege of Stirling Castle in 1746. In the lead up to the siege, the Jacobite army marched all the way up this hill towards the strategically positioned castle, passing on their way many historic landmarks that still exist today, including this, Mars Wark, which dates from the early 1570s. Originally built as a grand residence at the top of the town for the local Erskine clan, this once elegant townhouse was visited by distinguished guests including King James VI, but it's in pretty poor nick compared with Argyll's Lodgings just up the road. So what happened? Well, Mars Wark ended up in this ruinous state as a result of the Jacobite risings, the house devastated by cannons in 1745, which caused the Erskine family to abandon the building for good. though shortly afterwards, the local council converted the building into a large workhouse, which gave it its name, Mar's Wark. Wark meaning work, and Mar referring to the Earl of Mar, who originally built the lodging for the Erskines. Today, however, the impressive ruins of Mar's Walk are a scheduled monument that have been actively preserved through the years, and its presence here on Castle Wynd is one of a number of buildings that help to give us an idea of just what Stirling looked like around 400 years ago. However, along with Stirling Castle, perhaps the most important building in the city back in the 16th century was the grand church that stands just next door to Mar's Walk, the Church of the Holy Rood. Founded nearly 900 years ago in 1129, this is the second oldest building in Stirling, and one of the finest medieval churches you'll find in Scotland. Now, that original building of the 12th century burned down back in 1405, but the current building, which was rebuilt around 600 years ago, has an immense historical importance, as one of just two active churches remaining in the UK today that have hosted a royal coronation, the other being Westminster Abbey down in London. Stirling's Church of the Holy Rood was most famously the site of the coronation of King James VI of Scotland, which took place inside back in 1567, 36 years before James became the first monarch to rule over Scotland, England and Ireland, in an unprecedented union between nations that laid the groundwork for the formation of the modern United Kingdom. And as we learn on the sign just outside the church, this was also the site of a sermon hosted by famed Protestant preacher John Knox. But just why is Stirling's historic church known as the Holy Rood? Well, it's nothing to do with politeness, but rather a reference to the Holy Rood, an artefact said to be part of the cross on which Jesus died, and it's the same Holy Rood from which Edinburgh's famous Abbey, as well as the eponymous area of the city, get their name. Now, just along the road from the Church of the Holy Rood, we're passing by the Boys' Club, opened back in 1929 as a clubhouse for future Boy Scouts. Before the building housing the Boys' Club was constructed, however, this was the site of Stirling's old poultry and butter market, right at the heart of Stirling's historic commercial sphere, and its centuries-old market. We'll talk more about Stirling's market in a few minutes, but just across the road there stands yet another former medieval townhouse. Known as Bruce of Auchenbowie's house, the building dates from around 1520, and although it's been heavily altered in the 500 years since its opening, it still retains a number of original features, including the circular tower that we can see protruding into St John Street here. St John Street will lead us down the hill towards the centre of the modern city of Stirling, but we'll take a brief detour off the street for a moment now to look at what used to be the commercial heart of the city, centred on the Tolbooth here. The beautiful building with its clock tower that we see today dates from 1705, but the Tolbooth existed as the focal point in the civilian settlement of Stirling from as early as the 15th century, serving effectively as the town hall until 1875, when it featured inside local meeting chambers and the town's jail, which gained a fearsome reputation over the centuries. The conditions of the Tolbooth's jail were infamously poor, and it was just outside the building here that many public executions took place. But this part of Stirling wasn't all punishment and death, as the old town market was historically held right here on Broad Street. Just in front of us here is Stirling's old Mercat cross, or market cross, which denoted to traders the place where markets were held in the medieval town. And you might notice that the cross is topped with a unicorn, the national animal of Scotland, and the sculpture atop the Mercat cross here is affectionately known in Stirling as the Puggy. I'm not exactly sure of the origins of that nickname, but while local markets are no longer held around Stirling's Mercat cross today, this often quiet area of the city still draws people in, most notably to the old Tolbooth, which since the year 2000 has been used as an arts and music events venue, and remains a much-loved landmark among the people of Stirling. Now, as we've mentioned, we're currently walking through Stirling's Old Town, the now rather calm historic heart of the modern city, based around the mighty castle. Nowadays, however, the busy centre of the city has retreated down the hill away from this once strategically significant area at the so-called top of the town, although that's only a development of the last 150 years or so. But while the Victorian era heralded the shift of the city centre further down the hill, it didn't spell the end of development up here, as we find here in the form of Stirling's huge old Victorian jail, housed behind these walls. Now, as we just spoke about, the Tolbooth was once the home of Stirling's jail, but the conditions were so squalid and life inside so bad that prisoners eventually had to be moved out. That move came in 1847, when inmates were transferred just a few yards across the street to a more modern, purpose-built facility that, while providing better conditions for those inside, also made the prison far more efficient and easier to run. Back in the Tolbooth, it was typically a case of around 24 inmates to a cell, a fact which led it to being nicknamed by some in the 19th century as Britain's worst jail. But this new facility allowed inmates to be separated, intended to give authorities the chance to better rehabilitate lawbreakers, and it certainly did its job far better than the Tolbooth over the 41 years it operated. However, in 1888, Stirling's jail was converted for use as a large military prison, serving as the only one of its kind in Scotland until 1935, and while it remained in military hands during the two world wars, in the 1950s, the huge old prison took on a surprisingly delicious new use. In the 50s, the jail complex was bought to be used as an ingredients store for the Caledonian Confectionery Company, who made sweets. Now, the sweets were typically produced over in nearby Falkirk, but the ingredients that were stored here at the top of the town in Stirling are said to have produced an irresistible scent that wafted down the hill into the heart of the city. After a few years as a candy warehouse, however, the building was abandoned by the confectioners, before later being restored as a tourist attraction telling the story of the old jail, a role that it retains to this day. Outside the old jail's walls just next door, meanwhile, you'll find yet another striking historic landmark, once of great importance to the local Erskine clan. The site of the old Erskine Marykirk church, now used as a youth hostel, in the grounds before it here, there stands this grand structure, which is actually a tomb or mausoleum, and the resting place of one Ebeneezer Erskine, a leading figure of the historic clan, and an interesting figure in Scottish history. In the early 18th century, Ebeneezer Erskine was a priest with the Church of Scotland here in Stirling, but citing discontent with rules on how ministers were chosen at the time, Erskine decided to split with the church, and he founded the first Secession Church here in Stirling in 1740. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, the Secession Church, which started in this city, began to spread across towns in Scotland, and although it no longer exists today, the church was an ancestor of the present-day Free Church of Scotland, divisions of which you'll find in town centres all over the country. Now, we've been exploring Stirling for about 20 minutes, and only now are we reaching the edge of the historic old town, with the modern heart of the city visible just in the distance ahead. But while we know that the city centre moved away from this area surrounding the castle, why exactly did that shift unfold? Well, this all dates back to the final siege of Stirling Castle and the Jacobite risings. During the period of unrest as Jacobites sought to restore the Stuart dynasty to the British throne, the government used castles like Stirling as important military bases. But after the failure of the siege here and the eventual demise of the Jacobite rebellions after Culloden, the castle began to lose its importance. As such, with the strategic advantage provided by the top of the hill no longer a necessity, the urban centre of Stirling began to spread out far away from the area around the castle, and throughout the 19th century, the city grew in size significantly, expanding across the Forth Valley. This development was key for Stirling to retain some importance in the industrial era, as being located just beside the River Forth, which flows just a couple of hundred yards away from the modern city centre, Stirling was able to make use of the commercial benefits provided by the river, and we'll talk more about that as we make our way down the hill here. Just beside us, meanwhile, we find another of Stirling's many historic lodgings, an exquisite 4-star hotel that's housed within Stirling's old high school, originally opened back in 1856. The high school here was built to replace the grammar school that we saw just out the castle walls earlier on, and it remained Stirling's main educational institution until 1962, when the school moved again to outside the city centre, where it still operates to this day, although if you trace its origins all the way back, Stirling High School is one of the oldest schools in Britain. Just next door to the old high school turned hotel, we find another hotel, this one being housed within an exquisite bank built in 1825. As you could tell then, further down the hill here, we're seeing more examples of how Stirling saw greater development in the 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution brought newfound wealth to the region and the city. Many of the Victorian landmarks that we'll see at the bottom of the hill are designed in the same imposing style as the former bank. But just here across the road, we find one Victorian-era building that decided to do things a little differently. Stylistically unique in Stirling, this house was actually built only 130 years ago in 1890, designed in the style of a Tudor-era English house. It was the work of the prolific Scottish architect John Allan, who made his mark with a number of unusual buildings all over Stirling around the turn of the 20th century, including further English and Welsh-styled landmarks, but although they may not have looked particularly local, they still hold an important place in Stirling's local history. A few streets away on Port Street, you'll find the locally famous Wolf Craig building, designed by John Allan, and which bears on its facade a sculpture of the Stirling wolf, an animal in local folklore whose howls are said to have alerted the town's guards to an impending attack by Danish raiders back in the early medieval era. The best example of how Allan's architectural quirks were complemented by a deep interest in local legend. Now, we find ourselves nearing the bottom of the hill that we've been talking about so much on this walk, where you'll find the centre of the modern city of Stirling, which, as we mentioned earlier, began to move here during the Industrial Revolution. In all truth, Stirling was no major beneficiary of the Industrial Revolution, certainly not on the level of Glasgow or Falkirk, but the city here did draw in greater wealth thanks to the presence of an important local trading link, a historic harbour on the River Forth, which allowed products to flow in and out of the city towards the sea via the Firth of Forth. However, as other cities in Scotland's lowlands grew into major industrial centres through the 19th century, Stirling's position as a trading hub eroded, and so it never experienced a huge population boom as seen elsewhere in the region. And that's why Stirling, despite having once been arguably the most important place in the country centuries ago, ranks as Scotland's smallest city by population today. But the city's reputation still stands strong thanks to its illustrious history, from the many wonderful tourist attractions we've seen so far on this walk, to stories of heroes and battles past that took place just outside the modern city. We'll talk more about that shortly, but we've now reached the centre of Stirling today, at the heart of which there stands the landmark to our right, the Athenaeum. Built in 1817 on the site of an old local meat market, the Athenaeum went on to become a new centre of local government for 100 years from 1875 onwards, after the local authorities relocated their meeting place from the old Tolbooth, which at the top of the town had become increasingly detached from the action in the modern town centre. Noticeably busier than the area up around the castle, this part of Stirling is home to the city's railway station, a large retail centre, and restaurants and shops galore, some of which you'll find inside the city's storied Stirling Arcade, which dates back to 1882. Built during a period when covered shopping streets were all the rage, the Stirling Arcade is today one of just 5 Victorian shopping arcades left in Scotland, and through its life, it's been home to not just shops, but local hotels and even a theatre, all housed within a gorgeous interior, as pictured here. Given its rarity in Scotland, the Stirling Arcade is now one of the many protected landmarks that you'll find in this city, from the array of grand Victorian buildings in this part of the city, to the historic medieval monuments and edifices back up at the top of the town. But standing majestically at the top of King Street here, the Athenaeum is a building where Victorian and medieval heritage come crashing together, in the form of a famous statue that stands above its entrance. Depicting none other than William Wallace, Braveheart himself, this statue at the heart of Stirling pays tribute to Scotland's greatest warrior, and a man of real importance here in Stirling, as the leader of Scottish forces at a legendary battle that took place not all too far away. That was the Battle of Stirling Bridge, fought all the way back in the year 1297, when William Wallace gained a famous victory over England's army. Fought around the bridge across the River Forth just to the north of the modern city centre, The battle is renowned for the ingenious tactics deployed by Wallace's much smaller army, as they lured the English, who occupied Stirling Castle at the time, across the narrow bridge, at which point the Scots ambushed them. A brilliant surprise tactic that devastated the English armies, who suffered 5,000 casualties, while the Scots took one of their most famous victories of all. And as we pass by Stirling's beautiful Victorian municipal buildings, which also feature a statue of William Wallace alongside Robert the Bruce, the legacy of the Battle of Stirling Bridge remains strong to this day. A new bridge was built across the river in the 15th century, and overlooking it and the rest of Stirling is the mighty National Wallace Monument, a Scottish national icon dedicated to the legendary warrior. The Wallace Monument was built atop the hill known as Abbey Craig back in 1869, and it's one of a number of examples of grand Victorian architecture that you'll find around the city, although even in Stirling's predominantly Victorian city centre here, there are a few older landmarks to be found off the main streets. Just here, for example, you'll find the remains of Stirling's old town walls, which date from around the 16th century, and which once stood as the last line of defence for the highly significant town of Stirling. It's thought that the walls extended all the way up the hill from this area towards the Church of the Holy Rood, but owing to the immense strategic position of Stirling Castle, the walls weren't built on a particularly extensive or impenetrable scale, and today very little of the defences remain standing. Just outside the walls here is another Victorian landmark, Allan Park South Church, which was interestingly formed back in 1865 when it split from Ebeneezer Erskine's Secession Church, which, as we learned earlier, was itself created after a split with the Church of Scotland. And even more interestingly, the Allan Park South Church later ended up becoming a part of the Church of Scotland, bringing Erskine's original split back round full circle. Now, having stepped outside what was once the walled town of Stirling, we find ourselves on the sloping Corn Exchange Road, which leads west out of the city centre past yet more historic monuments. Across the road from us here, for example, is a statue of the Glasgow-born Henry Campbell Bannerman, Britain's first Prime Minister, or more specifically, the first government leader to be officially called Prime Minister, whereas his predecessors had officially been known by the historic title First Lord of the Treasury. Here, meanwhile, we find Stirling's principal war memorial, erected in 1922, and which stands in memory of the locals who lost their lives fighting in the two world wars. Passing by the war memorial as we make our way down the hill, we're now coming towards the end of our walk around this historic city, but there are more landmarks to be found in this part of Stirling, such as the characterful statue that lies a little further down the road. In front of us we can see a sculpture depicting one Rob Roy MacGregor, a famous outlaw dubbed by some as the Scottish Robin Hood. MacGregor, who lived in the 18th century, was a thorn in the side for the authorities of all allegiances in Scotland, and during the Jacobite risings he stole from both the British government and the Jacobites, although he may not have given what he took to the poor. In fact, Rob Roy MacGregor, or Red Rob as he was known for his striking ginger hair, may not quite have been the hero that many have heard of him as, because his folk hero status comes in large part as a result of a novel that was written about him by Sir Walter Scott in 1818, which more than likely exaggerated his life story. Still, thanks to Walter Scott, Rob Roy MacGregor is now a great character of Scotland's rich folklore and history, and here just beneath his statue there stands a monument to none other than Robert Burns, the author, poet and national bard of Scotland. A leading light in Scotland's Enlightenment during the late 18th century, Robert Burns's contributions to Scottish literature and culture throughout his life were immense, penning countless poems and travelling the nation collecting folk songs whose lyrics he converted into odes of his own, the most iconic of course being the world-famous Auld Lang Syne, sung on New Year's Eve, or Hogmanay as it's known here in Scotland. Stirling's contribution to Scotland's rich culture is undoubted. Its central role in the nation's incredible history is one thing, but the city today remains a wonderful place to explore the very best of what Scotland has to offer. That can be on a walk around town as we've taken today, or on a visit to one of the many cultural venues to be found in Stirling, from the old Tolbooth to the Stirling Smith Art Gallery, or the grand building we find in front of us here, the Albert Halls, one of the city's main venues for exhibitions, conferences and concerts today. Opened in 1883, the Albert Halls are yet another beautiful Victorian landmark to be found in the city centre, and they share the same imposing opulence as the centuries-old landmarks that we saw at the start of our walk around half an hour ago at the top of the town. Having weaved our way down from Stirling Castle, past the historic Church of the Holy Rood, the notorious Tolbooth, the grand old jail, and more, I really hope you've enjoyed it as we've strolled through Stirling's incredible history on this walk today. But sadly, it's here that we bring an end to our tour of this enthralling city. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Stirling for yourself sometime soon.